I'm very honored to introduce today's presenters, Kumar Baya and Will Innes. And now I'll pass this presentation off to Kumar.
Thanks, Stacy, and hello, everyone. So before we dive into today's webinar content, just maybe a very quick introduction on Cielo. Some of you might know who we are, but many may not. So Cielo really is one of the leading global recruitment process outsourcing providers. It has a term outsourcing, but we see ourselves less as outsourcers really, and more as a true extension of our clients' talent acquisition departments or functions. So essentially, really understanding what organizations' business goals are, and then being able to help them execute talent strategies to successfully achieve those goals. And we've been recognized by third-party industry analysts as well, like Everest Group, Nelson Hall, and the HR Today magazine for our excellence in service delivery. So enough about us. Let's just dive into the content for today. Starting with of the environmental factors that really affect the world of talent acquisition. I think to say that today's world of talent acquisition is complex is probably really an understatement, as I'm sure my TA friends regionally and globally would attest to. But I guess that also brings with it challenges and opportunities depending on how one responds to that. So there's four real environmental factors we see affecting the whole world of talent acquisition. The first one really is changing or rather increasing stakeholder expectations. So if you look at the C-suite, if you look at business leaders, hiring managers, they have demands from the talent acquisition function. They want to know what's going on in their markets. They don't want to know what their competitors are doing and so forth. And so procurement, in terms of the cost pressures, there's limited budgets to work with, but with less, there's also higher expectations, which becomes a bit of a paradox in its own right. Hiring managers have their own expectations, and so do our own talent acquisition teams. And last but certainly not the least, if you look at candidates, they have their expectations as well from employers or even future employers in terms of the information that they seek to really understand whether they are going to be good environments for them to develop their careers. So these are changing expectations that add some pressures to the talent acquisition function. And the next one is the emergence of the gig economy. So we see a proliferation of an increase of the use of contract and temp workers globally, and even in Asia, in certain markets more than others. And really, the size of this gig economy, which presents, on one hand, tremendous opportunities if you look at the various workforce elements. But then again, the reality is that traditionally HR has been the custodian for permanent or full-time employees, whereas procurement continues to own the acquisition of temporary or contingent workers. So in a way, the way the use of different workforce categories seems to be quite siloed. And really, what does that mean in terms of opportunities and challenges? We hope to be able to sort of understand and share some of those over the next 40 to 45 minutes. The next variable affecting the world of talent acquisition is technology. We see a whole slew of technologies out there that affect talent acquisition, and indeed human resources. In fact, according to CBI Insights, just last year alone, more than 2.9 billion US dollars was invested in HR technology, and we only expect this investment to increase. Companies have so many options at their disposal, but again, it's a challenge as to what's fit for purpose, and not every technology is suitable for every organization. What we found interesting from our research was really about artificial intelligence, blockchain, a lot of the other technologies being talked about a lot, not really seeing a lot of investment as against some of the more traditional areas of talent acquisition, just screening, assessment tools, or even good old applicant tracking. So really, is AI, RPA, blockchain more hype than substance? Again, something that we try to get some insights from our research, and we'd be happy to share some of what we found. And last but not the least, I guess increasing a need for transparency. We've always seen companies, particularly employers, want more and more information about their candidate markets, about candidates that they see in their shortlist, for example, their backgrounds, cultural fit, and so forth. But we are in an age where social media is pretty proliferated everywhere. It's on our smartphones, so candidates expect more as well. So it's a one-way process when organizations interview candidates. Candidates are interviewing organizations as well. And really the need for transparency about companies, what their benefits are, but also what opportunities exist in terms of career development, projects, etc., and the employer brand. These are all questions on candidates' minds as well. So there's increased transparency needs on both sides of the fence. So I guess all of these variables, they force us to really look at a talent acquisition model that integrates the different expertise elements, consumer-grade candidate and hiring manager experiences, and even technology and analytics to really provide talent acquisition to become a much more formidable force and really provide the value that is expected from these different stakeholders. So in today's session, we'll be using our global TA 360 research and also the insight we gleaned from some of the local think tanks in Asia and the other regions, from TA and HR leaders around their perspectives and feedback on the research itself, and sharing some of these findings and hoping to find some answers and sharing them with you as well. So really about the research first, we interviewed about 1,100 over organizations of medium to large sizes globally across various sectors. And we really looked at dissecting that by different functions or key stakeholders that touch talent acquisition, human resources, the business and hiring managers, and even procurement. We did this across 5 regions, so North America, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. To make it a more holistic 360 research, we even interviewed a whole bunch of candidates to get their perspective and their feedback on how talent acquisition was really performing. So really using that as a jumping point, let me invite my colleague Will to share our first insight from the research, which is on candidate experience. Over to you, Will.
Thanks, Kumar. So what we saw in the data is that everyone considers candidate experience a priority, but candidates aren't feeling it. And in fact, only 29% of respondents said they were very satisfied, which is less than a third, of course, and only 50%, as it says on here, hear back sometimes during the recruitment process. So that's a pretty big gap in expectation versus reality for what is a significant stakeholder group, thinking that for many organizations, they're going to interact with thousands of candidates on an annual basis. And we know the impact of a negative experience here not only impacts employer reputation, but also the propensity for that person to then interact with the brand as a consumer also. So it's a really significant gap. Does that surprise me? Unfortunately not. If you look at research by people like Talent Board, who specialize in candidate experience, they consistently point to this gap and in fact say that communication is the critical component. And I remember in our think tank, Kumar, I remember giving my views on this, how I thought this gap was going to exist really until technologies are more closely aligned to expectations. So adoption of CRM gets higher, or we see better communication, automation coming out from within an ATS. You're still going to have this gap to an extent. But an interesting point that came up in discussion is that if you think my view is potentially the top-down one, then there are definitely bottom-up interventions that can support improving this scenario. So that might be things like, very simple things like having clear explanations of your hiring process on your careers website. Or given that we know communication is can have the most significant impact on experience, why not audit the process you have in place and focus on improving those specific pinch points and improve piece by piece, so prioritize rather than just being overwhelmed by thinking of the whole ecosystem. And I remember, in fact, probably the year before, when we did a think tank in Hong Kong specifically about experience, we had speakers from Jebsen, Moody's, who have really managed to shift the dial by taking that sort of planned journey approach. So my takeout here is this is still going to be a problem for a while, but there are definitely things organizations could be doing. And I know it can be challenging, but breaking it down can be a way to really think about how to close this gap.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And I think talking about candidate experience, the next insight really not far from that really was about sourcing of candidates themselves. So, so if we look at one of the key insights that came out was sourcing great talent is a key priority, but sourcing technology is not. So, I guess the research confirmed, I suppose, in a way, the obvious that sourcing great talent is an absolute priority. If you look at human resources, talent acquisition, hiring managers, procurement, and even the CXO, talent is pretty much the lifeblood of any organization. You can have the best products, the best technology, best brands or whatever, but not having the right candidates, the right talent to execute some of those strategies and bring those values to the market really falls short in terms of meeting business goals. And it says source technology is not a priority. So let's just look at what that really means. So first of all, the research told us that from a sourcing perspective itself, only 24% of the respondents rated themselves very effective at sourcing great talent, which is just a quarter of the respondents thought that they actually fared pretty well in terms of attracting talent. And only 8% of the respondents said technology can help their organizations from a sourcing perspective. So really, it shows a very low standard in terms of organizations' ability to attract and source candidates, but also perhaps a missed opportunity in terms of not being able to leverage technology enough or appropriately to be able to address some of those sourcing challenges. But let's just take a quick look at the definition of sourcing itself, because we've found the organizations looking at it in a very, very narrow sense in terms of just identifying or finding the candidates. But in our conversations with various organizations that are effective in this, we look at a broad-based view to sourcing, where sourcing is really not just about identifying, but really identifying and attracting, engaging, and activating talent. So it's really a more 360 view about approaching the whole talent acquisition process, especially from a sourcing perspective. And all of these elements to identify, attract, engage, and activate need to be addressed fairly effectively. And I'm sure that 24% who rated themselves very effective, I'm sure are also trying to make sure that they're effective on all of these 4 different parameters. In fact, if we look closer to home, Sanofi, one of our clients here in Asia, they use technology pretty effectively from an automated sourcing perspective to really be able to engage pipeline talent for current and future use as well. So really technology as a leverage to be able to address candidates who are very, very tech savvy, who engage with potential employers via their smartphones, are accessing social media. And recent research told us that on an average, candidates about 14 different sources before they sort of decide whether they want to apply to an organization or not. And these include things like Facebook, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, the career websites. So there's a lot of opportunities that may be missed by organizations in terms of attracting and really providing a well-articulated message around the organizations and using technology to leverage that as well. And I think the next point that came up in some of our local think tanks was also really going back to basics and investing in developing some of the soft skills or the sourcing skills of the recruiting or the TA teams. So really looking beyond just keyword searches, beyond LinkedIn, looking at social media, Facebook search, for example, more optimal use of Boolean strings, X-ray, web mining. So all of these bringing it together, but at the same time working on soft skills to be able to engage with the business, to be able to sort of provide a view of talent landscape, leverage on the employer brand, and articulate and tailor the messaging to different candidate communities. So I guess from a soft skills and from a technology standpoint, there seem to be opportunities that exist in the marketplace and for organizations, and to leverage more on technology to be more effective at the whole sourcing dimension. And speaking of technology, perhaps it's great for me to just pass over back to Will to talk to us about a technology dimension.
Yep, thanks, Kumar. I think sourcing is going to be such a huge frontier in the competition for talent, so it's a fascinating area. But yeah, so continuing theme of technology, the insight here, AI doesn't appear to be delivering on the hype. So in our research, we asked what kind of technology solutions deliver the most impact into TA's successful delivery. And respondents pointed, if you look on the left towards the bottom there, towards some of the other areas. So actually prioritizing things like background screening, assessment, analytics, even on the right there, careers websites rating slightly higher than artificial intelligence. And I mean, these are slightly open to interpretation. And I think one view, well, my personal take is that whilst there has been a lot of hype about artificial intelligence, the fact is that people in the industry are now focusing on the outcome they need to achieve, and the tools they need to help them get there. And I think some of this is about language and definition, because the reality is that AI has been used for years now, really matching the increasing of automation in various stages of talent acquisition. Anything, sorting big amounts of data in hiring funnels, matching candidates in sourcing, screening, so forth. So I think this chart points to a positive step, that we're seeing a maturing in the market, where as we deepen our understanding of the real definition of AI, and build more of a shared language around that, the hype, as you might say, will continue to die down, hopefully. And what we're going to focus on is outcomes, processes, tools, and importantly, where that leaves humans and where we make the most, or add the most value into the process. So it's a trend I see dying, but yeah, like I say, my interpretation is that it's more in the language of AI, and people are pointing more towards the outcomes in things like screening, video assessments, rather than going, this year I must include some AI in my thinking. Actually, the reality is people are focusing on outcomes, and that shows a maturity in the market and for things to come. So I take it as a positive.
Good stuff. Thanks for that, Will. I think switching gears now, I think moving from technology to really the type of talent that's coming into organizations, and how organizations are really acquiring the diverse workforce being managed. So in our research, we found that nearly 70% of the business leaders believe the existing talent pool is shrinking, while the competition for talent is increasing. So again, we're seeing this, especially in the Asian markets, where economies are growing, and talent pools are in fact getting smaller. It's becoming harder to find that talent, and then 54% of the business leaders interviewed have more open positions than ever before. I think what's making it interesting is that 30% of stakeholders that we interviewed in the survey have non-permanent roles as part of their workforce, and in 55% of the stakeholders expect the flexible or the non-permanent workforce taking on even a bigger chunk of the absolute workforce. And what was interesting is that about 23% of senior roles and 28% of managerial levels, so almost a quarter to a third of middle to senior level positions, were being hired on a contract on a non-permanent basis. Probably a bit different from what I would have imagined before the research. Then again, if you look at some of the reasons, we're seeing the aging workforce continuing to contribute, but probably in a more flexible approach in the workforce. So yes, full-time employees, but at freelance workers, statement of work, project work, and contract workers as well. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the generation entering the workforce, Generation Z and so forth, it's not surprising to see that they want more variety. I speak to my 2 teenage kids, and the kind of work that excites them, the kind of projects they like doing in school, it's projects, it's variety, it's travel, it's moving from one topic to another. And so that probably itself to the kind of workforce elements as well that the future generations might be expected as well, in terms of more contract work, more project work, so forth. So I guess companies, what does that mean to companies? Is that really they need a more consolidated and overarching strategy to support the entire workforce, and that's really what total talent really is needed. But really, before we dive into some of the insights around total talent, let's just take a quick view at what total talent really is, and importantly, what it's not. So for us at Cielo, it's pretty clear. Total talent is really a central view. It's essentially a way for organizations to really acquire all types of talent, both employees as well as contingent workers, and also extending into the non-traditional workers, including independent contractors, freelancers, and even statement of work workers. I think what's important, if you can see at the bottom of the slide, is that it's not necessarily MSP and RPO. And I think that's important because that's what we see in the market, even in Asia Pacific. Several organizations that are using, contingent workers and are using full-time employees, and they have partners that they engage, be it MSP partners for a contingent workforce management perspective, and RPO partners in terms of helping acquire full-time workers. And is there a missed opportunity from a total talent perspective? I mean, that's what we tried to garner from some of the survey as well as the local insights. And something very interesting came up is that total talent, it's definitely something that companies want, companies are talking about, companies are inquiring about, but really who's going to own it is a big question, because no one seems to be wanting to give up control. So when we interviewed the HR folks, they seem to suggest that total talent should be under the domain of HR. In fact, 65% of the HR folks believe that they should be owning total talent. That's including the acquisition of permanent and contract workers. When we interviewed procurement, in fact, 69% of procurement feel that they should be owning total talent. So I think this divided view on who should be owning total talent has obviously come in the way of a broader adoption or embracing of this particular model. And so we see a continued siloed approach towards the acquisition of contingent workers versus permanent workers. So some of the insights that we gleaned from the local insights, in fact, in Singapore, we had the Talent Rising Summit on the back of this research late last year, shared some pretty useful information. One was the fact that the feedback that came through was that we have HR and procurement as part of the conversation, but what about the business? Business leaders need to be part of the conversation as well, because they're the ones who are the main stakeholder. They are the internal customer. They need, business goals to be achieved, and really a tripartite conversation between business, HR, and procurement is really essential. And bringing data. So we have organizations that use partners such as MSP providers or use VMS technology that have the data around the procurement of contingent workforce. And there are companies that, whether they use partners or not, in-house talent acquisition as well, they are using applicant tracking systems that have a fair amount of data on the acquisition of permanent workers. So really, the recommendation that came from the research and from the local insight think tanks was, let's bring the data groups together. Let's have a conversation over lunch or coffee in terms of where are the workers coming from, in terms of permanent workers or contract workers, and really look at what the needs of business is to come up with some strategies in terms of how we could apply the workforce demands and supply and reduce the gap between them. And last but not least is really, as a starting point, invest maybe in a partner, to start the dialogue, and you just look at maybe an integrated approach between the acquisition of contract workers and permanent workers indeed. So that was an interesting insight that came up. And, moving on to the next particular insight, over to you, Will.
Yeah, great, thanks. And this one's still at that sort of more macro level. It sounds slightly controversial when you first read it, but when you reflect a little bit more, we may not be that surprised when it says business leaders, when asked, are not satisfied with our TA strategy. So if we dig into that a little deeper, you'll see how we asked respondents to our 360 research to rank the effectiveness of some different elements of talent acquisition. And what's interesting is that the different stakeholder groups have a different view of the effectiveness of these efforts. So if you take business leaders in yellow there down the left-hand side, as an example, you can see that they're actually fairly significantly behind in terms of realizing the benefits of some of these areas, whereas comparatively, the C-suite is more optimistic. So what we think about here is that business leaders are going to be more concerned with the efficiency and the effectiveness. So getting their positions correctly filled properly, right? That's their priority, to have the people to deliver their business areas objectives. Whereas you look to the C-suite, they're going to be more interested in brand, reputation in the market. So it's maybe not surprising that you've got different drivers that are impacting their spheres of influence, interest, or where they're going to place value. The other consideration here, thinking about the data, is that business leaders are often hiring managers. In fact, I think it's 2/3 of the people that we researched here are hiring managers. So that's going to impact their rating a little bit more. So let's think about, well, what do we learn from this? I think it's understandable these groups are going to have different drivers or expectations, right? But when I think about alignment and maybe how do we close some of these gaps, a bit like the conversation on total talent, the biggest thing that came up in our live session in Singapore was about this relationship between hiring managers and our colleagues in talent acquisition. So quite often we may have a hiring manager that only uses our services a few times a year, maybe even once. So they're likely not going to understand the process that well, or at least it's very easy to see how their expectations could get slightly misaligned with what we're trying to achieve. So where we see this really being improved is actually probably on the last line of this graph, which is about using recruiting analytics. And what we see in businesses that share analytics regularly and as, more importantly, part of their core internal process. So when you're sat with a hiring manager talking about supply and demand, market dynamics, salary data, previous hiring data, performance rates, whatever it may be, these gaps in perception of effectiveness can really be shifted. In fact, we see that time and again. We run hiring manager surveys as part of our standard RPO services. So what we're seeing is it's not just about broadly communication that helps gain alignment or closing these gaps. It's specifically about what you're communicating and how. And here, I think the idea of using data to inform decisions, educating, will really help manage these different drivers or expectations more accurately. So that's my take on this one, Kumar.
Thanks for that, Will. Kind of resonates with several of the conversations I suppose we're currently having with some of our customers as well. Speaking of technology and its use in terms of driving the use of analytics to really improve the effectiveness and the transparency in talent acquisition and its efforts, one of the key insights that came out was that quality of hire is the gold standard. The gold standard in terms of measuring the effectiveness of talent acquisition. I suppose everybody agrees really that data and insights are key to managing a high-performing function. But what we're seeing is that different stakeholders really want talent acquisition to move beyond the time to fill and the cost to fill as well. And research has shown us that quality of hire was really right at the top in terms of the gold standard to measure the effectiveness. And if you look at metrics, really, there are two pillars, two types of metrics, really. One is efficiency, and the other is experience. And we've seen, especially here in Asia, there's been a shift, and more stakeholders are now focused on experience metrics over efficiency. So efficiency would be more like cost to fill, time to fill. I mean, I remember speaking with prospects, organizations looking to improve the talent acquisition function and really, focus primarily on time to fill, the cost to fill, and these very basic hygiene factors was the be-all and end-all of the effectiveness of a TA function. But then what could compromise was quality. I think a very good question to ask the business is, if they are pushing the talent acquisition on a certain time to fill metric, let's say 40 days for a certain level of hire, and if you just ask the business, would an increase in time to fill by 20 to 25%, but better quality of candidate walking through the door and being part of the team, would that be something that would resonate? I think, most times, in fact, 10 out of 10 times, you'll have the hiring managers give you a resounding yes to the fact that they would definitely prefer quality over quantity. And I guess the real magic is, finding a balance between both. So in terms of, time to fill being a very important measure, we've seen that moving obviously to quality of hire. But what we've seen as a challenge in the marketplace is really understanding what the definition of quality of hire is. And it seems to vary from company to company. So in what we're seeing most often is organizations that do embrace quality of hire, again, are really measuring more hygiene factors under the guise of quality. So essentially things like, what's the feedback from the hiring manager on the recruiting process? So that's more around process and less around quality of the candidate or the hire, and really the impressions on the candidate perhaps, and sometimes even retention, of the new hires over the first 3 months. So not really qualitative measures, again, more quantitative measures that get guised under measuring quality of hire. So when we asked organizations locally as well, especially in our think tank here in Singapore a couple of months ago, I think there was unilateral kind of feedback, in fact, unanimous feedback that the real definition of quality of hire was really the impact it had on the business. So really the time to performance, time to productivity, the performance at the end of a certain period. If you look at the feedback, for example, for hiring managers at the end of a 30-day period or 60-day period, or even a longer term, instead of 1 year. And it can be a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, because then it allowed organizations to really have a correlation between the effectiveness or the quality of that hire truly with the efforts made by the talent acquisition team. And then having a closed loop feedback system, from the hiring managers back into the talent acquisition department to then see what kind of strategies need to be tweaked or adapted to ensure that the quality gap was minimized and the business got what it wanted. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there, but I think from an Asian standpoint, we see quality of hire increasingly a metric that companies are looking at, but there still seems to be a gap in terms of really understanding what it means or how it needs to be measured, and also a certain limitation posed by technology itself. So you've got applicant tracking systems that measure the whole recruiting process right up to onboarding, and have HRIS systems which measure which basically track an employee record and the engagement, the performance management, and so forth. So really the data is already there. But really the challenge is, are these systems speaking to each other? Are they integrated to provide that closed loop mechanism that I just referred to be able to then make some meaningful insight out of that the data and make some improvements as well. So I think there's definitely an opportunity as companies look at technology and getting the best ROI from the technology to look at integrating some of these systems to get the transparency and really enhance their effectiveness on a variety of metrics, not the least of which is the quality of hire. So with that, I suppose we've come to I think the end of the key insights, high-level insights from our research, our TA360 research, and I suppose just summarizing those 6 key takeaways that we've just covered the last half an hour or so. The first one really being about candidate experience. Everybody acknowledges, agrees it's a priority. They aren't feeling it, and there are certain opportunities, as Will shared, as to how one could impact that with some low-hanging fruit and some structural changes as well, using technology, using brand. The next one being sourcing, being important for everybody and a priority, but sourcing technology was probably not a priority, but not being entirely leveraged effectively, and therefore maybe a good opportunity being missed on that front. We talked about technology and particularly AI, whether it not delivering on hype, but really it's a question of understanding, simplifying the definitions, seeing what it really means, and really starting small and doing some basic things right before we start doing some big things as well. The next was we talked about total talent and the shift of the workforce more towards contract workers. We know that in Asia, it's still largely a permanent worker market, but we're seeing more and more usage of contract workers and the need, therefore, to have a consolidated total talent approach towards the different workforce components. We then talked about the business leaders not being entirely satisfied from a macro perspective, but then again, it was more around looking at leverage use of technology, better better communication and effective partnership between the TA functions and the various stakeholders within organizations. And last but not the least, we looked at more qualitative measures, looking at the effectiveness of talent acquisition, with quality of hire really being the key gold standard that set the benchmark for the effectiveness of the function. So with that, what we will be doing in terms of next steps as a follow-up to the webinar is the TA360 report that we've been referring to throughout our webinar. The research really following this webinar, we'll be sharing that with you. We'll be sharing a recording of the webinar as well, and also a simple worksheet, a really simple tool that we used, for the survey, but you as talent acquisition or HR leaders could use within your organizations to start the conversation. Start the conversation with some key business leaders, and really to assess the current effectiveness of your current talent acquisition strategies. So this could just be a starting point for conversation, but something that would give you maybe a good plan to focus and prioritize on certain key elements for 2019. So do look out these few in your inbox in the next 48 hours or so. Back to you, Stacey.
Thank you so much, Kumar and Will. And before we jump into questions, I just want to echo what Kumar said and remind everyone that the webinar recording and presentation deck will be emailed to you tomorrow. And we do have some questions for you both. This one is for Will. Did you see any regional differences in the candidate experience results? And what key trends would you highlight for this space going forward?
Okay, so regional differences, I don't believe we saw a great deal of difference, and Kumar, keep me honest here, but I remember looking at that, and also that was echoed in so our own 360 research, but also Talent Board's research, which looks at I remember comparing APAC to America, and the results tracked very similar there. And what I would put that down to is that we're seeing globally consistent trends in candidate expectations accelerating, but our technology and other dynamics just basically not keeping up to the same extent. And of course, we've got the very human need for communication and to feel important. We all want that as both people and candidates. So the differences and the nuances across regions really come into play with things like the channel or the approach. So the variance comes in the detail, not the macro trends. So yeah, regional differences, not so much at the macro level. I think that was a two-part question as well. That was also about other trends. Well, there's quite a few here. The big one at the top of my mind would probably be about personalization. So much more of that. So for example, learning what a user needs on your careers site, maybe what they've searched before, or understanding what their location is, looking at IP addresses, then we serve up the most relevant content. And that kind of example is where you're going to increase engagement, and you'll see conversion tracking higher. The second part is that we would see a trend towards adding value to the candidate experience and trying to move beyond just the basics. Even though we've got a way to go there, I think the leading organizations are going to move beyond that, and move beyond just giving basic information about kind of culture and employee stories. But what we're starting to see is internal teams hiring content designers, for example. So they're providing things like career coaching information and really valuable experiences. So they're curating an experience that isn't just about jobs, but also about brand and experience overall. So I do wonder whether we're going to see a further sort of elongation of the maturity curve, where there'll still be people trying to catch up with their technology and get the basics, but we're also going to see the leaders move into an area where they're curating much richer experiences. Yeah, I think that's what I can think of from the top of my head.
Great, yeah, and we also have, it's more of an observation than a question, but maybe you both could weigh in. From the standpoint of recruitment, they're saying rather than quality of hire, a better measure might be quality of candidates. given that to measure quality of hire, you have to wait 3 months or 6 months after hire, and often the onus is how the new employee adapts to the new working environment. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and you're right. I mean, we need to sort of measure both the short-term and the long-term impacts of how effective the TA's the function is doing, and how it's impacting the business. So we when we look at some of our clients, for example, there are some basic SLAs or KPIs that are built to measure the effectiveness of the recruitment function. So, for example, if you look at the turnaround time in terms of presenting shortlisted profiles to the hiring manager, if you look at some of the conversion ratios in terms of shortlist to interview, for example, and then even further on as well in terms of interview to offer. So those are metrics that are being measured. So we do anecdotally also look at feedback from hiring managers in terms of the quality, and in fact even from a quantitative perspective, when we run hiring manager satisfaction surveys at the end of a certain hire, we can and that sum total comes up over a quarter or over a longer period. We started looking at some trends in terms of how satisfied hiring managers are with the quantity or quality of candidates being presented. So I think to an extent, organizations are probably doing this, but there's definitely an opportunity, and it's a great observation, that there is an opportunity for companies to do more of that. But I think what organizations are doing much less of, and probably need to look at in terms of integrating the system, and really having a closed loop feedback, as we shared earlier, is really the holy grail, which is the quality of hire, because that's where it brings a lot of credibility to the talent acquisition function. They are then perceived as true partners to the business. We all know, being in talent acquisition, that can sometimes be a challenge to articulate the value. And I think, in going on the value curve, moving from some of the hygiene and the basic delivery KPIs and the efficiency metrics to more experience-based metrics. So we talked about candidate experience that will shift, but it's also the hiring manager experience, which can really be about how they feel the talent acquisition function is doing. And I think the biggest correlation for that would also be the quality of the candidates that they are getting from the recruiting team, and eventually the quality of performance from these candidates and hires that are made. So yeah, great observation, couldn't agree more.
Great, and we have just one more question, it looks like. This one's to you, Kumar, just sort of about what you're observing in the Asian market around total talent. Are organizations talking about this, and do you think there is an appetite for this here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not surprised it's come up. In fact, this was a question that even came up during our think tank event late last year as a follow-up on the 360 research, which dished out this particular insight around total talent. And we had a little bit of a skeptical view on whether this was going to be relevant to Asia, but surprisingly, it definitely is. And let me explain. In fact, this is what came up in the think tank event, like I shared. First of all, there's definitely a higher use of non-permanent or full-time employees by companies. So contingent workers, contract temp workers, freelance workers, independent contractors, even statement of work. So it's not a recent phenomenon for companies to use these different workforce types in Asia. I remember, maybe about 8 years ago, a couple of organizations like Motorola, Sun Microsystems, before they were acquired by Oracle, that's a long time ago, and it probably shares my age as well, were using outsourced partners, contingent workforce outsourcing or MSP partners, to manage their contingent workers and the spend of the contingent workforce across these different worker types. So it's not something that's new, so that's existed. RPO, we know, has existed at least for the last 8 to 10 years in APAC. It's probably gotten more momentum and more wheels over the last couple of years. But then again, what we do see in the market is really a siloed approach by most organizations in terms of the way they acquire contingent workers, either directly themselves via procurement or through a partner such as an MSP provider. using VMS technology, and then a siloed approach compared to the acquisition of permanent workers, which is either using in-house talent acquisition teams or using RPO providers, using applicant tracking systems as the technology or the technology of record. So it continues to be a siloed approach, but there are cracks that are coming through. There are gaps in terms of unfilled positions, that are just relying on full-time employees. There are great candidates coming through the non-full-time workforce components as well. There are older employees that are probably looking at close to retiring and still contributing to the workforce, the aging workforce, and some great skills and experience, and very keen to work on a part-time, on a project basis. And even the new workers coming in, Generation Z and so forth, that are embracing part-time work, project-based work on an independent contract type of work. So like it or not, we have to embrace these different workforce elements and really have an overarching strategy. So when we speak with prospects, companies in the market, we may not be using the terminology total talent, but there's definitely a need to sort of consolidate our approach towards acquiring talent, and that's definitely being discussed more and more, and definitely an opportunity for companies to look at as part of the talent acquisition strategies as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Will and Kumar. That's all the questions we have for this, and for everyone who joined in, and wishing you a good rest of your day.